Good evening. I'm Pam Hufnagel with the League of Women Voters of Clarion County, and we're pleased this evening to welcome Ann Anderson, who is a member of the DC League of Women Voters Board of Trustees, and she has served as the chair of the DC League's Committee for Full Rights for DC Citizens since 2014. She's also advocated for DC statehood since 1971. Anne is a clinical social worker. She retired from the Washington Therapy Guild after 45 years of private practice as a counselor and psychotherapist. She's also been involved in some international affairs. So she served as coordinator for Psychologists for Social Responsibility for 20 years. She consulted with the War Crimes Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda with the coordination of women's advocacy and with the International Technical Assistance Group of Christian Children's Fund, responding to crises in several countries, including after 9/11 in New York. She's very experienced, therefore. She has a BA in non-Western history from Grinnell and a Master of Social Work from Catholic University. She's very proud of her children and grandchildren also, and her birding and her jungle backyard. Now, this is a webinar format, so you should be muted. And if you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of the screen. And, I'll be watching that. And Brianna Ripkes, who's off screen right now, may also be watching that just to make sure that, we get the questions answered. The chat is there, but only if we want to share some links with you. All right. So with that, I turn it over to you, Anne.
Thank you, Pam, and thanks so much for inviting me. We are so pleased to be able to talk about what's going on in DC because there's so many things that people don't really realize. It's very hard to understand how this works when we're supposed to be in a democracy. So, like Pam noted, I've been doing this for a very long time. And so in order to make sure that I stay on track and don't go off and say, I remember when, I'm just going to make sure that we read things. So the first thing I'm going to do is that I'm going to roll DC Home Rule and DC Statehood into a quick summary because it's important to understand how we're governed right now and what the remedy of statehood would look like. So we've been governed under the Home Rule Charter since 1973, which the first elected officials took office in January of 75. Right now, there are 47, maybe 48 bills now in Congress that interfere with home rule, even some of them calling for the repeal of our Home Rule Charter. So let's dive in, take a quick look at history, and make sure we all know how things work. And I'm going to try to move this. And I'm not seeing how it's... Why am I not able to move?
You should be able to just click right on the right side of your screen or use the arrow pad.
I was trying to use the arrow pad, but I guess I'll use the right side of my screen because that seems to be working better. Here are key dates. This is going to be a race through 224 years of history. I'm going to touch on the critical moments. So in 1801, when Congress moved in and passed the Organic Act of 1801, that meant they were exercising exclusive control over DC. Even back then, the congressional record shows that people were concerned about changing citizens back into subjects. So this was not exactly what the founders wanted. Then if you jump forward to 1847, the important thing there is that Congress returned the part of Virginia that had been ceded to DC back to Virginia. To do this, they needed votes by people who lived there, by the state, and by Congress. So this created an important precedent for reducing the size of DC. Then in 1871, Congress established a territorial government, but Black freedmen started running for office and getting elected. So they abolished it. This is when the infamous statement from a white segregationist was made that, quote, sometimes you just have to burn down the barn to get rid of the rats, unquote. They installed a 3-commissioner system that lasted until the 1960s, when first President Johnson changed the system to a mayor commissioner and an appointed council. That was, and it was in 1964, the year that I moved to DC, when the 23rd Amendment to the Constitution finally allowed DC citizens 3 electors and the right to vote for president. Back then, it really looked like we were on the road to greater democracy in our nation's capital. Then if you jump forward to 1973, that's as a result of the real work by many civil rights advocates. DC was actually allowed limited home rule. And at that point, the League of Women Voters delivered 1.2 million signatures in support of home rule. So we really made a big deal and a big difference on that hearing. And in 2016, we voted here in DC overwhelmingly to apply for statehood. The plan is to reduce the footprint of the federal district, like happened in 1847, and then allow the residential and commercial parts of DC to apply for statehood. The House has now passed the DC statehood bill twice, and there are Washington, D.C. admission bills in both houses of Congress. And please note that we've never been closer to D.C. statehood, and we're also currently in danger of losing what little democracy we have. As I mentioned, at this time, there are 47 or 48 anti-home rule bills introduced in Congress. And furthermore, there are 18 riders on the DC appropriations bill that would further restrict our capacity for self-governance. So now I'm going to see if I can click again. There we go. So this is a very quick overview. I've included a summary of how there were home rule episodes before 75, but when we got home rule in 75, they were working with funding restrictions, such as being prohibited from taxing people who worked in DC but lived elsewhere. And for the record, in other parts of the country, the general practice is that income gets taxed where you work. Oh, but here it gets taxed where you live. So for instance, if you work in New York, but you live in New Jersey, you pay taxes in New York on that income and report that fact to New Jersey. And then they have agreements about how these details are handled. They also had major liabilities that the federal government forced on them. For instance, all DC government employees had previously been federal employees and were part of the federal pension system. Under the Home Rule Charter, DC inherited an unfunded pension liability from the federal government, $2 billion. It was only a matter of time, even under the best of circumstances, before the Home Rule government would be in financial trouble. So in 1994-95, DC was basically bankrupt. And that's when the control board took over the running of the district. But even they could not manage their way out of the financial hole that DC was in. DC's unique status created major problems that needed fixing. For instance, the charter called for DC to manage many state functions like education and Medicaid, but didn't have the state taxing authority. 43% of DC's land was exempt from property taxes because it was federal land or embassies and other tax-exempt entities like the American Red Legion, Daughters of the American Revolution, to name a couple. There was a federal payment that was supposed to compensate DC, but it was never enough to cover the shortfall. So the control board recommended major changes to the relationship between DC and the federal government, finally fixed the unfunded pension liability it had saddled DC with, took over some state functions like the criminal justice system, and adjusted the share paid by DC for Medicaid. For the record, looking a little ahead, when Alice Rivlin, who's no longer with us, unfortunately, but she was head of the control board, she was asked if DC could afford to be a state. She declared, DC cannot afford not to be a state. She was referring to all the ways that Congress hampered DC's governance. So let's see if I can do this again. Here we go. So here's how we do it right now. We now, elect a mayor, 13-member council. The elected officers of our limited home rule system function much like other places in the USA. The mayor presents a budget, council reviews and amends the budget, passes and sends it to the mayor who signs it or doesn't. So legislation is introduced by members of the council and or the mayor, and it's passed by the council and sent to the mayor who signs it or vetoes it. Council can override a mayor's veto if they have enough votes. We have a chief financial officer who has to approve all financial decisions. So that office is deeply involved in the development of the budget. And that was established during the era of the control board and is carried forward today. So let me explain about ANCs, Advisory Neighborhood Commissioners. They're the closest elected officials to their constituents, and they deal with all kinds of local issues, zoning, public services of all kinds, potholes, traffic issues, etc. But when ANCs have recommendations, they forward them to council or to appropriate agencies, all of which are supposed to give great weight. That's a quote, give great weight to their recommendations. We also have a team of congressional shadow officials whose job is to advocate for DC statehood. They're called shadow representatives and senators because the idea comes from the Tennessee plan. That's the plan that Tennessee used to apply for statehood. They established the proposed boundaries like we did. They promised to govern with a representative government, and they elected shadow representatives and the senators who traveled to Capitol Hill to lobby for admission to the Union. So we followed the Tennessee plan. So our shadows are unpaid positions, but have a small budget to cover their activities. All of these functions are basic to local government. I'm sure you recognize them, and they happen everywhere in the US. But only in DC must all decisions taken by our elected leaders then have to be transmitted to Congress for their review. There are 30-day and 60-day review periods. The 60s is for criminal laws, but these aren't calendar days. The days that Congress is in session are the only ones that count. So it used to be that we needed to wait until Congress had voted to approve our laws, but our delegate, Eleanor Holmes Norton, has been successful in streamlining many aspects of our relationship with Congress. Now we can just wait for the layover to pass without any motions of disapproval for our laws to finally go into force. It was also in 2013 that we were allowed, I'm going to put this in air quotes, budget autonomy over the funds raised by our local taxes and fees. The recent continuing resolution treated us as if we were a federal agency. That was in 2024, like we used to be, and left out the language that allows our budget autonomy. Then the Senate passed a standalone bill that restored our budget autonomy, but it didn't pass the House, and we're $1 billion short from that. So that just goes into our coffers to wait for whenever we're approved of spending it. So currently, our home rule powers are this set of possibilities. You know, we can pass local laws and regulations, we can manage city services. Please note that these powers encompass state, county, and municipal functions that would normally happen in the 50 states. And so please remember that all of these are subject to congressional approval or lack of disapproval. All of these powers would revert to Congress if home rule were repealed. Now, there are things going on in the Congress right now. Like, for instance, there's a bill that prevents us from prohibiting right turn on red. I want to know what's going to happen. So there's a power of Congress over DC. I just want to be clear, you know, that this can be repealed. Our home rule can be repealed at any time. Congress can also pass laws that apply specifically to DC, and they can also refuse to provide funding or refuse to allow DC to use locally raised taxes to fund programs passed by DC. So I'm not going to go into this very detailed, but these are the kinds of things that are being questioned, are being attacked, interfered with right now. So the power of the president also has power over DC. The DC's judges are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. And the president may federalize the DC Police Department for 30 days in an emergency. And you just saw that happen. His 30-day emergency ended September 10th, but we are still under all kinds of federal agencies using strange and interesting ways of grabbing people off the street and disappearing them. The president is the only one who can call up the DC National Guard. And of course, we saw on January 6th how that was delayed. And it's the National Guard, the DC National Guard, is now patrolling DC streets, metro stations, along with National Guards from 6 states. They're all fully armed. And by the way, we have also seen them picking up trash, laying out mulch, doing those kinds of things. So aside from what the power of the president has over DC, Congress is still the main body who exercises exclusive control. So now let's just take a quick look at what the current status is of DC statehood. So interestingly enough, we have now gone to 203 co-sponsors. For the longest time, we were 190. Now we're at 203. So what's going on has prompted people to go ahead and co-sponsor the statehood bill in the House. We still have 43 co-sponsors in the Senate. But the priority action in this current political atmosphere is protecting DC's limited home rule. So let me just move to some statehood myths, because these are the things that we also always hear. Statehood for DC is a local issue. It doesn't affect me. Well, DC is often used as a proving ground, as we're seeing right now, for unpopular measures that would never pass in the 50 states. Members of Congress impose rules on DC that appeal parts of their base back home, but drastically affect us. For instance, preventing needle exchange programs, the use of local funds to help low-income women get abortions. The outcomes of many issues taken up by Congress might be different if there were 2 senators and a representative from Washington Douglas Commonwealth who could vote. So then there are other people who say it's unconstitutional. To that I say, absolutely, you are correct if we were asking it that all of DC become a state, but that's not what we're asking. We're asking for there to be continuing to be a federal district, much smaller, but it's already been reduced. So there's precedent. And that frees up the rest of us where we actually live. 700,000 people live here. And so DC can become a state by an act of Congress signed by the president. There's no constitutional amendment needed. And when the new state is admitted, the nation's capital will still be in the federal district under the control of the Congress, and it'll still belong to all Americans. So then there's a question, oh, it's too small to become its own state. Well, acres don't vote. People do. Washington, D.C. has more residents than either Vermont or Wyoming. I heard the other day somebody said, we have more than Alaska. I'm not sure about that. I haven't checked the latest census, but I know we're very close. And there are 6 other states that are well under 1 million people, and they have 2 senators and a representative. So, just to be clear, framers of the Constitution dealt with geographic size differences by making representation in the House by population, and then an automatic 2 senators from every state. And then, well, let's just send them back to Maryland or Virginia, because we hear that all the time. It's called retrocession. But guess what? State boundaries can't be changed without the consent of the state. So the Virginia side of DC went back to Virginia, as I've already mentioned. It was voted on, and Congress agreed. And guess what? Maryland legislators have been polled and overwhelmingly do not want to take DC back. And then finally, there's this thing about statehood as a power grab by Democrats. Well, we're in a very polarized political atmosphere right now. But the first DC statehood bill of the modern era was introduced by Fred Schwengel, Republican of Iowa, and Ron Dellums, Democrat of California. So while more than likely the first congressional delegation from the new state would be Democrat, there's no reason to think that it always will be that way. Hawaii and Alaska were admitted to balance party affiliations, and these 2 states have since flipped. So to be very clear, there are 3 major reasons for statehood for DC. Equality. We are second-class citizens. Equality with U.S. citizens who live in the 50 states. We elect a mayor and DC council. Congress can still throw out our laws and change our budget, regardless of how DC citizens feel about congressional mandates. If people in the 50 states disagree with their representatives and senators, they can vote them out. But we have no vote in Congress. We need the liberty to govern ourselves. So unlike all the states, the federal government runs DC's judicial system. As a state, we would take back our judicial system and run it according to the values we hold in DC. So aside from the constant threat of interference by Congress in our limited home rule, without statehood, the judicial system is totally out of our hands. And then finally, without statehood, we remain subjects of Congress because they have exclusive control over us. And, not to put too fine a point on it, but the reality is that as we are subject of Congress, we then become subjects of the 50 states. We're often fond of saying we're surrounded on the north, south, east, and west by the United States of America. So it's it gets old. But here's what it would look like. No, see all the green part? That's where the state would be. See the light part? That's the federal district. And guess what? There are no licensed residential facilities in that little white part, that little lighter part. That's all mall and federal buildings, and there is the White House, but people in the White House vote in their home states. So so the real question that we often get, even after we look at this, is why people should care. Well, those of us who live in DC are reaching out to our friends and relatives who live in the 50 states. You're the ones who have the power to tell your members of Congress to vote for the residential and commercial parts of DC to be admitted as a state. If we in DC have a voting representative and 2 senators, we can help with the things you care about. We wouldn't have to sit on the sidelines, which is what we're doing right now. We could take our place as full citizens, participating in our representative government. It's only fair. And then taxation without representation, which is still a potent argument. And we are the people of DC who are still the only ones who pay federal income tax and have no voting representation in Congress. So what you can do, talk about our limited home rule. People just don't understand. We've been to 33 states talking to leaguers and others, and we've traveled or Zoomed. And one of the most common questions we hear is, do you really live in DC? Because they find it hard to imagine. And we answer yes, along with about 700,000 other people. They don't understand that DC is full of vibrant communities where people lead regular lives, raise children, play in the park, go to church, run businesses that have nothing to do with the federal government. Furthermore, people who live in the 50 states, like Pennsylvania, are constituents of the members of Congress who have the power to respect DC's limited home rule and also the power to grant statehood. And you can subscribe to LWVDC Substack.com for weekly updates on what's going on with us. You can go to Statehood, our Statehood page on our website for more information. And if you want to schedule a briefing with anybody, I am happy to schedule that, because that's what I do. So here's a couple of other things to do. You can sign our DC Statehood petition. Again, you can talk to your neighbors and relatives and friends. You can invite a speaker. We can do speeches. We can do all kinds of things. You can get your organization to adopt a resolution supporting DC statehood. And guess what? Pennsylvania has already done that. You have adopted our resolution. Thank you very much. And finally, I'll just close this and stop this share so that we're back to real people, because I'll also now just talk a little bit about what's been going on, and then we can open it for questions and comments. So right now there's no helicopter over my house at the moment. In the last hour, there were 2. There are checkpoints that pop up almost everywhere. National Guardsmen are patrolling fully armed. Traffic is much reduced. I can get to my son's house across town in 15 minutes, which usually takes about 25. Pedestrian traffic, much reduced. It's like a ghost town. And families are banding together to walk their children to school because they don't want them to end up suddenly hitting a checkpoint and don't know what to do. Restaurants, they're hurting because who wants to go out on the town while men with guns patrolling the streets? And people are being pulled off mopeds, out of vans as they try to go to work. We don't know where they're being taken. Due process is absent. And let me just read you a couple of things from a local newsletter, a very local newsletter called the 51st. At any time, any given time, residents spot groups of people wearing masks and neck gaiters stopping their neighbors. Sometimes they also have a hat and sunglasses so that no part of their face is visible. They often don plain clothes with bulletproof vests that have little to no identification markers aside from the word police. They're federal agents, but who is behind the mask and what department they're working for is often a mystery. Is this MPD? Is this DEA? Is this HSI? Is this ICE? Says Tiffany Johnson, the Advisory Neighborhood Commissioner, ANC, for 4B06. We don't know. And that's the kind of things that ANC commissioners do. So let me just say what we're doing in DC in response. We have an organization. It's called Free DC. It's being very effective in bringing people together in neighborhoods to provide mutual aid, alert people when checkpoints are set up, film police, federal agent, and National Guard activity, and make noise on street corners, porches every night, 7 o'clock, 5 minutes. I missed it tonight because I'm with you guys, but I had to tell my neighbors where I was. Sometimes it gets really noisy. The DC League is providing briefings about DC statehood. We're sponsoring well-attended screenings of a historical film called The Last Battlefront, Quest for the Vote in Washington, D.C. I can set up a screening for you if you want that. We're working with organizations in the democracy space to distribute organizational sign-on letters that go to Congress. LWVUS has been very supportive too in calling for a halt to the occupation of DC. And so we've made little coloring books with DC state symbols for kids to color while their parents are in meetings to deal with the occupation. And in August, we launched a DC Statehood Now game, which went very well, thank goodness. And I can provide you with the game to play. We've also been reaching out to those state leagues that have not yet adopted our resolution supporting DC statehood. We only have 18 to go. So thank you, Pennsylvania. So let me just close with a couple of really nice things that happened because I don't want us to fall into the abyss of despair. So on Saturday, we held our annual showcase, Youth Voices for DC Statehood, where we heard from 12 young people demonstrate their musical talent, share their spoken word, and display their State Fair award-winning artwork. So we are so pleased to celebrate the efforts of our next generation. In the midst of a dreadful autocratic occupation, we continue to carve out time and space for community connection, joy, and appreciation of each other. And then on last Friday, the DC League was out on 16th Street Northwest greeting the marchers in the We Are America march that came from Philadelphia. It started September 6th, and they were intent on bringing the Constitution to Congress in DC. And we simply said, welcome to DC, and handed them DC statehood buttons. And they were so pleased to see us. They immediately donned their buttons and after a short rest, proceeded down the street to the welcome rally on the National Mall. So for me, that was another moment of real joy to greet people from elsewhere who share the vision of America as a vibrant, inclusive democracy who understand that everyone must have the liberty to govern themselves and the right to choose their leaders, their right to be protected by the Constitution of the United States of America. Thank you. Pam, you're muted.
Thank you. Oh boy. I'm always telling other people they're muted, and here I went and did it myself. So I was looking in the Q&A and nobody had posted any questions. I just was wondering, you mentioned some myths about, like the DC statehood thing. And I just was wondering if there's any other reasons, like, so if any, people who are opposed to it come up with any other reasons why they're opposed to it other than those reasons that you pretty effectively shot down.
Well, I mean, I would love to be able to appropriately say, well, here are the real reasons. Unfortunately, they are really strange reasons. During the hearing a couple of years ago now, there were people who were saying that we couldn't be a state because we didn't have bowling alleys.
Bowling alleys.
We have both. We do have bowling alleys. They also said we couldn't be a state because there weren't any car dealerships. Well, there are car dealerships. There was another congressman who said you couldn't be a state because there was no mining. Well, there actually have been mines historically in Washington, D.C. There are no usable mines now. But so the basic thing that people talk about, and I've talked about the Democratic power grab, is this whole thing that it's like, well, we're not going to give, Democrats 2 senators, da 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 da. So it's really all political, but let me also be very clear, it is based on racial discrimination, and it has been all the way along. People have been terrified. And this is the last battlefront, the quest for the vote in Washington, D.C., is a marvelous film that really brings out how often race has counted as an issue for people to keep us down. So, the real issue is political. It's not. There's no reason other than the politics of it for us not to be a state. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, that was pretty interesting. I mean, the certainly political, but the bizarre reasons that some people put forward are just very, very strange.
Yes.
So, okay.
Well, you know what, Pam, I think, I mean, to help people understand why they would do that. I think about those first grade puzzles, where you get the US map with the little wooden puzzles, and each one of the puzzle pieces, Texas has the longhorn and Kansas has the corn, and
Oh yeah.
that kind of thing. And I think that people are kind of stuck in that. Well, but what is DC? It's too small. It has to, they can't figure out how to manage what would in fact be an urban state. And they don't know what kind of, if you can't really put the capital on it, because we would not be, the nation's capital would be in the federal district and we wouldn't be there. So they can't quite figure out what to do with us. So I want to give them some grace that they're struggling with having learned what states are for in their first grade and haven't, worked further than that when they start to think about trying to make us a state. But I think there really is some difficulty with imagining how we would be a state, just like they have difficulty imagining that 700,000 people live here. No, our eighth graders from all over the country come to DC to visit the Capitol, and they do not go away from the mall. So they never see. Nobody comes to my house, when you're coming as an eighth grader. So, I got to give them some leeway in why it's so difficult to understand who we are. So.
Yeah, yeah, I had not actually thought about it that way. That's, interesting perspective. And I find myself trying to think, okay, what could they put on that little puzzle map for DC since you can't put the capital on? Um, hmm, I don't know.
Yeah.
Oh, there's something came up in the Q&A. Okay. Oh, here's a message that says, thank you for this wonderful overview and for your persistence against all the obstacles that have been put in the way of DC's statehood. Keep on fighting. And then a question, actually. How do we gain momentum for the movement for DC statehood when we are fighting so many strikes against our democracy?
Well, thank you. That's a great question, because part of the way that I'm thinking about it is all over the country, people are fighting to protect voters, to protect the vote, have good elections, make sure that we actually can get everybody to vote, be able to vote. All eligible voters can vote. And guess what? We are the poster child for voter suppression, because we haven't been able to vote for members of Congress since 1801, not voting members of Congress. And we only were able to vote for the president starting in 1964. Well, so up till then, there were no votes. There were no votes in Washington, D.C. So there's something about that I think is a critical piece to move forward, especially as we move into this next year, 2026. It's like, wait a minute, let's take stock. Let's take stock. We have been a nation for 250 years, and for 225 years, we have not allowed the people of Washington, D.C. to be full citizens. How about we rethink that now? How about if we move that forward? And I think that's one of the ways that we're doing it. I mean, and that's why we're reaching out to all the state leagues right now that haven't joined us. And like I say, there are only 18 left. Because as soon as we have, lots and lots of people who are saying, actually DC statehood is a good idea and we are behind it, then when, it's like, guess what? Your members of Congress, they need to get reelected next year. So what happens if you say, oh, gee, I'm not so hot on you if you're not going to support, full rights for everybody. And by the way, that includes Washington, D.C. I want it to be a state. So if you can't do that, maybe I'll vote for the other guy, So I think that's how, I mean, that's why we're doing this now. It's a snowball, it's a building, it's a continuing process, it's an education, total education, because okay, I'll tell this little story. I think I was in Iowa giving a presentation to a league somewhere in Iowa. I forget, Des Moines maybe, or Grinnell, one of those. And I'm giving and I talk about, we don't have the vote. And this woman in the sort of the third row back said, but that's un-American. And I was like, yes, ma'am, it is. And I think that when people finally get it, and I'm like, wait a minute, when I don't support Washington, D.C., I continue to function as if I'm okay with them being my colonists, with me being the colonial master of these people, these 700,000 people, which is not okay. And most people, when you actually ask them, are you comfortable with that? They're like, no. They actually believe in full rights. They actually believe in the liberty to govern yourself. And but they don't realize it. When I table in DC and somebody comes by and say, would you like to sign our petition? And they say, oh, well, I don't live in DC, so I can't sign. I'm like, really? You don't live in DC? That's fabulous, because you're the people that we need to use your voices and talk to your members of Congress to give us full rights, to give us statehood, because we can't do it, because we don't have the power. You have the power. So I think those are the kinds of things that I think we really need to keep rolling out and educating. And when you do it that way, when you talk about let's get everybody to vote, let's support full rights, let's support all people being able to vote, then I think you also are working in your own states with the voter suppression that's going on, whatever. I don't know what's going on in Pennsylvania, but I imagine that you're struggling just like everybody else. And because point to Washington, D.C. and say, how about this? Let's give them the vote too. And by the way, then, we're a pretty progressive place. So, maybe you'd like us to help you out. How about other things like climate change or gun issues or gun safety or women's right to choose? All of those things we have to sit on the sidelines. So, which is extremely painful.
Yeah. Okay, well, so Brianna just put a link to the petition in the chat. So
Thank you.
those who are still on can get that. I opened all the links that she put in the chat so I can send those to the people in my league. If they weren't able to attend this evening, which we do have more people in our league than actually attended this evening. So yeah, I'll make sure they get those.
Thank you.
Let's see. I don't think any more questions came in.
I have a question. Hi, this is Brianna Ripka from the
Okay.
State League. So we often focus on the legal and constitutional dimensions of DC status, but I was curious about the practical side of the conversation. So from your perspective, how ready is DC in terms of local governance and civic infrastructure to sort of take on those responsibilities and, potentially go through that transition? I would like to hear your perspective.
Thank you. That's another lovely question. So first of all, Washington, D.C. is not a city. I mean, we often call ourselves a city. People call themselves a city, but it's actually a federal district. And as such, we manage municipal issues, we manage county issues, we manage state issues. So we're already doing all of those things. We have a new constitution that we voted in 2016, which if and when we become a state, this would be the constitution that we would start with. it expands our council. Right now we have 13, we would have 23 because we know that we would need a lot more council members to handle the volume of things that are already overwhelming our 13-member council under our home rule charter. I think we're doing fine. We all, of course, always have somebody who's been not acting properly, and we have one council member who was removed, and that's, but it's like, if we want to talk about that, then we need to talk about Illinois, who's put 5 governors in jail. So maybe they don't need to be a state if you have to deal with, but maybe we just need to be a state anyway. So our systems are working, and they are working as well as most any municipal, county, state functions are, and obviously we can always do better, but we have some fantastic nonprofits that do a lot of, hey, what about this? What about this? And our civic life is really quite robust. So I think that that we would be fine. One of the things that I want to be clear about is that we would be taking back our judicial system. And that is one of the things that people often say, oh no, how are you going to do that? Well, we have several nonprofit organizations that have been working on, well, if we were going to do that, what would we want to do and how would we want to do it differently? And my bet is that we would have really the state of the art rehabilitation, restitution, all those kinds of different ways of handling criminal issues. We spent 10 years updating our criminal justice code, which hadn't been really updated since, I think, 1909. Don't quote me, but it's in the 1900s. And 10 years and everybody signed on. I mean, all of the partners, all of the the players that are involved in the criminal justice system, and we used the sort of state of the art, this is how you ought to do it, and we came up with our new criminal code, and Congress refused to allow us to put it in. So we are back to the 1900 whatever as the base. And of course, there's all these little pieces that have been, tried in this way and that way. And so it's a very complicated criminal justice code now, but that's where we are. So, if we were a state, we would immediately go back and pick up all that really good work that was done and, update our criminal justice code for sure. But while we're under the thumb of Congress, we can't do it. So that's the kind of thing. Does that help, Brianna?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Anne. That answered my question thoroughly. I appreciate that.
Sure.
Yeah, I don't think we have any more questions in the chat, but we may have time for one more I have, if that's okay with you, Pam.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Okay, so this debate, of course, isn't happening in a vacuum, and it comes at a time where tensions are certainly high between state and federal power. And you touched on that a little bit earlier, and you expressed how you're seeing that, firsthand. And I'm curious how you see this DC statehood or autonomy conversation reflecting in these larger trends in American federalism today, and what this could potentially mean for the state, the potential state of DC in regard to this federal occupation.
Well, people have been saying, never waste a crisis. So there have been people who've been saying, well, maybe this will give us an opportunity to explain what's going on. But right now, it's extremely painful. The last I think the last count I saw was something like 1,300 people had been arrested or detained or taken away or removed from, which autocratic method do you want to use right now? So that's 1,300 people, and that's 1,300 families and communities that have been devastated. And so I am very much concerned right now about stopping this occupation of Washington, D.C., because they really are using us as a petri dish. They're trying it all out. They're trying to normalize that watching military guards in the street is fine, and that's what we need. And no, we do not need that. That's not okay. This is an autocratic takeover. And so one of the questions that I keep having is like, how do you right now resist what the occupation is doing, and at the same time point to the remedy for us, which is statehood, which isn't going to happen very soon. I mean, it's not going to happen in the next year for sure, because it takes a congressional action. We need to have 51 votes in the House, and we need 60 in the Senate, we're assuming, because somebody would filibuster. So we need 218 votes in the House and 51 or 60 in the Senate to actually make it happen. So the real question, I think, it comes back to paying attention to the individual right to vote and the disenfranchisement of not just people in Washington, D.C., but people all over the country who are being deprived of their vote in all the ways that people are trying to do that. Just one of the reasons why I continue to be happy to be a member of the League of Women Voters. So I think we're doing what we can. So
Thank you so much, Anne. I'll pass it to Pam to wrap it up for us.
Yeah. Wait a minute. Something came in. All right. Oh, a question came in. Do you have a list of the representative and senators who are supporting DC statehood?
yes, you can go to congress.gov and put in HR 51 and S 51, and you will get the list of co-sponsors for the House, both the House and the Senate.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, all right. Seeing no further questions there. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
The history, it was a little mind-blowing, but I think, when you get right down to it, like I said, the main thing is we got all these people who are disenfranchised and treated as colonists of the rest of the country, which is a unique way of looking at it. that I had not thought of. So thank you very much for your presentation. And this was recorded. So those of you who attended, if you wanted to go back and look at some of the things like the timeline again, or, review that, because it was, I,
That was
it was a
a
little
bunch of
quick for
stuff.
me. But
Yes,
yeah,
it was
that's
a
fine.
bunch of
I mean,
stuff.
things that, we didn't know. So that's good. So we can review it at our leisure later. So thank you so much, and, keep up the fight, and have a good evening, and hope you don't have any helicopters tonight.
Yeah, I haven't heard any so far.
Okay.
Bye,
Thanks
Anne.
so
Bye,
much.
Pam. Thanks so much.
Good
Okay.
night.
Okay. Bye-bye.